I go out to everybody. So
No, you got 1 minute.
yeah,
Oh,
and
she's got. Oh, you
yeah,
see that red thing?
oh, I got no. I
Put
think
it
we're
in the chat if you want to say something.
yeah, I'm fine.
Text. Write it in the chat, Nikki.
Yeah. I'm like a little kid, Marvin.
I get. Are we live? Okay,
I think we're live.
maybe. I don't. I can't figure that out. But anyway, hopefully we're live. Someone will tell me if we're not. Welcome everyone to session 1B, Environmental Justice Scorecard and Legislation Accountability. I'm going to make some brief opening remarks and then I'm going to introduce myself. Or maybe I'll introduce myself. Yeah, I'm Dr. Malva King, and I actually retired from EPA, Office of Environmental Justice, about 25 or so years ago, maybe 30 by now. But I'm happy to be here with you. I've been working in environmental justice all that time, and I'm still working in it. I actually serve on a board. I'm a chair of a board, and I do some work for other organizations in this field. And I'm moderating this session because I'm a good friend of Jacoby Wilson. I first met him when he was a PhD student. He's certainly grown up nicely. Anyway, I welcome you to this session. This session is about legislator scorecards that have been successfully used by the NAACP, ACLU, and other organizations to hold legislators accountable to their constituencies. Nicky Sheats will be up first, and he has a different little twist to his presentation. He will be talking about government accountability first as it relates to New Jersey and what he has done in that state. The other three presenters will talk about individual EJ scorecards. So please make sure you put your comments in the chat as we go through this presentation. If you want to have a burning comment from one of the presenters, I will make sure they hear about it. Uh, and the rest of the comments can be at the end of our presentation will be grouped together and any of the presenters can answer them. All right, Nicky, you're up first.
Thanks a lot, Marva. Sophia, could you pull my slides up for me, please? Could you go to the next one, please? Thank you. So this is me. My name is Nicky Sheats. I work at I am the director of the Center for the Urban Environment at the John S. Watson Institute for Urban Policy and Research at Kane University. It's a small center. It's basically me. I'm also a member of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance and very happy to be here this morning. Next slide, please. And so here's the game plan for my talk. As Marva said, I'm going to talk about legislative governmental accountability in New Jersey and the issue of cumulative impacts. I'm turning on my timer, Marva. So here's the game plan for my talk. I'll do some background on cumulative impacts first, and then I'll do some background on the history of cumulative impacts in New Jersey, and then I'll talk about an innovative New Jersey EJ law that address cumulative impacts that we're trying to implement right now in New Jersey. Next slide, please. So let's start off with a formal definition of cumulative impacts that the New Jersey EJ community uses much of the time. And that is that cumulative impacts can be thought of as the risk and impacts caused by multiple pollutants. And these multiple pollutants are usually emitted by multiple sources of pollution in a neighborhood. And the risk and impacts caused by these pollutants both individually and when they interact with each other and any social vulnerabilities that exist in a community. Next slide, please. It is arguable, and we can talk a little bit about that later, that cumulative impacts is the preeminent environmental justice issue across the country. It's also been, unfortunately, one of the toughest EJ issues to address, and that's for several reasons. One is that the way we in this case, the country and states, usually attempt to regulate pollution is by setting individual pollutant standards. So we go pollutant by pollutant and we set a standard. The problem with that from an EJ point of view is that often if that individual standard is not violated, government will tell communities there's nothing we can do about siting new facilities in their neighborhoods. And the problem with that from EJ point of view, as community members often say, is that we don't breathe in pollutants or experience pollutants in pollutant by pollutant. When you breathe in air pollution, you breathe in all the pollutants at once, the particulate matter, the sulfur dioxide, the nitrogen oxides. As I often say, it's not like you have compartments in your lungs where each pollutant goes into a separate compartment. They all mix, but the law does not reflect that mixture. It does not have a cumulative pollutant standard. And so even though no individual standard may be violated, you can still have detrimental health impacts if no individual pollutant is violated, but the law typically does not recognize that. Next slide, please. And here's the other problem. Here's another problem with trying to address cumulative impacts. And this gets us into legislative and governmental accountability also. So these are two figures produced by New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. I will admit to you they're somewhat dated now. They come from 2009. But I will also say that nothing up until now has been done really to significantly disrupt the relationship that you see portrayed in these figures. Nothing in New Jersey or in the country for that matter, nothing significant. So look at the top figure. These figures show you a relationship in New Jersey between cumulative impacts, race, and income. So in this instance, you can think of cumulative impacts as a very rough estimate of the amount of pollution in New Jersey neighborhoods. So the first thing that New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection did was they assigned a cumulative impact score to every neighborhood in New Jersey. Then to figure out the relationship between the estimated amount of pollution in New Jersey neighborhoods and race and income, they graphed it. Look at the top figure, and you'll see that as the number of people of color living in New Jersey neighborhoods increases, so does the estimate of the amount of total pollution in a neighborhood. And the same is true for people for living with low income. As the number of low income people living in New Jersey neighborhood increases, so does the estimate of the total amount of pollution. And I'll say what I've said a lot of times. You've heard me before, I apologize. What these figures are showing or providing evidence of is that if you live in New Jersey, the amount of pollution in your neighborhood is connected to race and income. That is the color of your skin, the amount of money in your pocket. And this goes against everything that at least the country and the state claim that they stand for. And of course, what we're concerned about is that the disproportionate amount of pollution you see depicted on the right of your screen in communities of color and low-income neighborhoods, i.e. EJ, environmental justice neighborhoods, that this disproportionate pollution load is partly responsible for the health disparities that we see in our country that are rooted in race and income. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. And so as EJ advocates in New Jersey, we see this relationship as unacceptable. And we knew it was there, but this confirmed it. Right? And so we start developing policy to address it. Here comes the governmental responsibility and legislative responsibility. You know that relationship exists. What are you going to do about it? So as EJ advocates, we develop we develop cumulative impacts policy on both municipal level and a statewide level. I'm not going to talk about the municipal level. Municipal level policy was adopted by our largest city, Newark, in 2016. But we also developed statewide policy addressing cumulative impacts that we started advocating for. Next slide, please. And here is an outline of the history of cumulative impacts in New Jersey from a community and from an EJ perspective. You see, we've been working on it for many years. We formed our first cumulative impacts committee back in 2007, 2008. I say we, that's the New Jersey EJ community. That's New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, of which I'm a member, and allies, both in and outside of the EJ of the EJ community. And I can't remember, I'm going to be honest with you, I can't remember why we dissolved that committee, but we formed a second committee that was composed only of New Jersey EJ Environmental Justice Alliance members in 2000. And I think, what did my timeline say here? 2010. And remember, it's EJ Alliance, so there were multiple organizations there. And we developed the policies that I referenced before: statewide cumulative impacts policy and municipal level. Now, in 2012, actually, our senior female legislator issued a cumulative impacts bill. And it was interesting because she didn't talk to us, but it must have been motivated by our work because no one else was talking about cumulative impacts. And we supported it, but it didn't go anywhere. The next big thing that happened with cumulative impacts was our work with Senator Booker in 2017, Cumulative Impacts New Jersey, and now this is nationwide. He came to us, New Jersey EJ community, with and close allies, with a environmental justice bill. It didn't have cumulative impacts in it. And we said, well, if you're going to do an environmental justice bill, you need to have cumulative impacts in it. And we gave Senator Booker's office our statewide cumulative impacts policy. And they integrated it into the bill in an altered version, altered format, but it was integrated into the bill. This is 2017. It was submitted to Congress and not adopted. But in 2018, we think this provoked the next New Jersey environmental justice law, cumulative impacts bill, which happened in 2018 by a senator in South Jersey that's become a hero for us, Troy Singleton. And we worked with Senator Singleton from 2018 to 2020 to get that bill enacted. Next slide, please. And so here are the guts of the New Jersey EJ bill. It starts off by defining what the bill calls overburdened neighborhoods. It says that if you're a block group that is at least 40% of color or 35% low income, or whose residents who's at least 40, or where at least 40% of the residents are of limited English proficiency, then you will be considered an overburdened community. Now, look, from the EJ point of view, we would call these communities environmental justice communities because the criterion used to define them do not include any environmental indicator, only demographic indicators. And we should have pointed that out, but quite frankly, we were so happy that we were working on this bill. We let that go. And the bill goes on further and says that if you're seeking a major pollution permit in one of these overburdened neighborhoods in New Jersey, then you're going to have to do an EJ analysis. And if that EJ analysis shows that environmental and public health stresses will be higher is located, then due to granting the pollution permit, then if it's a permit for a new facility and stresses would be higher due to the permit, that permit application shall be denied. If it's a permit for renewal, or a permit renewal, or a permit for an expansion of a facility, even if stresses would be made higher by the permit, it won't be denied, but conditions can be placed on those permits. Next slide, please.
Nicky, you have a 5-minute warning.
Thank you, Malva. So what the state has done is issued regulations. They were issued in June, and we're in the process of getting together our written comments. We're going to meet this afternoon. They are due in early September. And the regulations, one thing the regulations do is they describe how to do this EJ analysis. And you can ask me about that later if you are so inclined. Next slide, please. They delineate what are the environmental and public health stressors. Next slide, please. And here are 12 of them. I won't go over there, 26 of them, but you can see the stressors include pollution, cancer risk, number of permanent sites, traffic. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And here are important aspects of the law that I won't say fought over, that we discussed with the state when the bill was being put together. And I want to focus on one of them, compelling public interest exception. That exception in the law says that even if granting the permit would make stressors higher. If you serve a compelling public interest, then you'll get the permit anyway. Next slide, please. And I want to focus on that because that, of course, is in the regulations, and we are very concerned about that because that could upend the entire law. And so we are urging that New Jersey DEP interpret that as narrowly as possible, so there will be very few exceptions. But industry is, and it tried this before the regulations came out, is arguing that that exception should include economic considerations. So here's where we come back to accountability. So basically, the industry wants to trade off jobs for pollution. And we think this will essentially kill the law. And we don't think communities should be put in the position that industry will come and try to bribe them and say, if you accept this pollution, we will give you more jobs. In fact, I will just say personally, I think that's extortion. I think it's extortion to go to a community and say the only way you would get the number of jobs you need is by accepting more pollution that will make you sick and in some cases kill you. So we're pushing back. This economic considerations are not in the exception now as the regulations stand, the proposed regulations stand, and we are urging DEP not to let them in. Here you talk about accountability. This is it. So what we did, there were 4 hearings about the regulations, one in Central, one in North, one in South Jersey in person, and a virtual hearing. And in the hearing in North Jersey, we have exceptional EJ organizers, and they were able, I went along for the ride, to get over 150 people to come to the hearing in North Jersey. And the vast majority of these people told the state that economic consideration should not be part of this exception, that there should not be a trade-off, pollution for jobs. And by the way, other communities don't have to accept pollution to get the number of jobs they need. So it shouldn't happen in our communities. And we hope that the state listens. We ask the DEP folks that will run the hearings to take this message back to the governor's office. Next slide, please.
2 minutes.
Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And I'm going to finish with this. We think that if the law and regulations are implemented correctly, we will make significant movement towards addressing cumulative impacts in EJ communities and elsewhere in New Jersey. But we understand that the law is not a silver bullet, that along with this cumulative impacts law, and by the way, I should say this, why this law is so significant is because it's the first law in the country that we know of that says you can and shall deny applications for pollution permits under certain circumstances based on environmental justice and cumulative impacts. But this one law is not enough. It needs to be paired with other strategies and laws and policies so we can fully address cumulative impacts in New Jersey. We've coined the phrase, we need cumulative policies to address cumulative impacts. Thank you for listening. I look forward to any questions you may have for me at the end of all our presentations, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the presentations also. Marva, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great. So what Nicky didn't tell you, and when he introduced himself, that he serves on the White House Environmental Justice Council. He's one of the leaders there, and I'm really happy to see him there because he brings a great perspective. And what I also wanted to let you know was that I live right next door to him in Delaware, and that EJ bill that they put out has been such an influence on this state. So you never know what you're doing in one state and how much it influences the other. So I really appreciate that. Nicky, I don't see any questions for you in the comments. So what we'll do is we'll go to the next speaker, and that's Raya.
Hi, can folks see and hear me?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. And can you see my slides?
Not yet.
All right. Could you go ahead and put up? Oh, all
Oh, there
right.
they are.
There they are. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Sheats, Dr. King. Today, yes, my name is Raya Salter, and I'm going to talk about environmental justice scorecards and legislative accountability in the energy sector in the context of lessons from New York's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. So yes, I'll go ahead and briefly introduce myself. I am an energy justice attorney, author, and activist. I'm an adjunct professor of law at Cardozo Law School. I've practiced energy regulation in private practice for the Environmental Defense Fund, for the Natural Resources Defense Council, and other entities. Most recently, and notably for this particular presentation, I spent 2 years as the policy coordinator for the New York Renews Climate Justice Coalition, and I'll talk a bit about that. I also serve on the New York State Climate Action Council, which is the body tasked with creating New York State's plan for how we'll reach our ambitious climate goals that was created as a part of the climate law that I'm going to talk about next. All right, so first I want to mention, and Dr. King talked about the power of state action, and it really is true. Folks don't know enough that the Justice 40, the Federal Justice 40 initiative, actually started in New York. Why? Because a group of activists, the New York Renews Coalition, shut down then Governor Cuomo's office and demanded the passage of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. I was there as legal support on that day. That picture you see. What did the law say? Among other things, that disadvantaged communities must have a goal of no less than 40% of the benefits of climate spending, among other things that we don't have at the federal level. So I wanted to give that context about the CLCPA, and we'll dig in a little bit more about it. So what is the CLCPA? It is one of the nation's most ambitious state climate laws. We're talking 100% net zero economy-wide by 2050, but it also includes, because of its activist heritage, really the nation's most robust energy justice, in particular, provisions. And what do I mean by that? So it's a lot of info, and there's a lot to talk about, but we're going to talk about a few of them. In addition to the requirement of the 40% sort of Justice 40 mandate, this New York mandate that was lifted to the federal level, we have important pieces that are not at the federal level. One, state contracts must not disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. As someone who says that phrase a lot, it's hard, disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. I could say it, I've been saying it for a long time. This is this idea of an environmental justice guardrail, a do no harm, which is something that we would like to see, at the federal level and in states more broadly. Emissions and co-pollutant reductions must be prioritized in disadvantaged communities. Can I say that's an unfortunate phrase? Nobody likes it. New York law took it from California law. We like to say priority communities, very different phrases, but that's where we're left with. But look at that. As you're talking about an energy transition, you must prioritize emissions and co-pollutant reductions in certain areas. It's in the law, but we need to make sure it gets implemented in addition to this 40%. So let's get back to the energy sector. There are some very ambitious targets for the CLCPA and energy. 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040, 70% by 2030, big asks for energy storage, wind, solar, energy efficiency, et cetera, similar to a lot of what you see in IRA. That's what we're calling it IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. So query, right? If this is going to be a big part of the substance of how we're going to address the climate crisis, and we know that IRA is a compromise that a lot of us are very circumspect about, what does it mean to have EJ guardrails, prioritizations of emissions and co-pollutant reductions? As Dr. Sheats talked about, cumulative impacts, we're still fighting for that, wound into the energy policy. So as a way to start digging into that, I wanted to visit sort of a case study or story from CLCPA implementation. So the mechanism for how New York State is going to focus in on the energy sector in particular is through a Public Service Commission proceeding called the Renewable Energy Program that is tasked with developing the regulatory framework to implement the CLCPA's targets for the energy sector. The state has big things to say, right, in their economic analysis about jobs and direct economic investment. But as New York Renews and as the advocate for New York Renews, how is this framework going to reflect the justice provisions of the CLCPA? So here where we started, right? This is something I think is important. You need to update that economic impact analysis, but even more so, we need to invest in the science, the social science, the art, the economics, the health of how we actually study these impacts. We need to bring in the pioneering analyses that Dr. Sheats talks about. And so we're not just talking about this in terms of what are the economic benefits and jobs, but what are the real impacts of these investments? We need to work on that. And we ask the state to do that. Also, we need a compliance framework to implement and track the CLCPA's energy justice provisions, or they just won't get tracked. So the approach that we took, let's leverage the law's compliance framework to create a baseline for this analysis and ongoing reporting. So I'm going to close soon, and I know there are a lot of bubbles here, and you don't need to get caught up in the bubbles in particular. But the point is that, as many of you may know, in any of these state legislative laws, a lot of times we build in different roles for different agencies over time, right? The DEC is going to do this, and at the same time, the Public Service Commission is going to do that, and so is going to have a study. So the idea here was, and I work with Columbia, the Sabin Center a little bit on this, let's go ahead and map out what this actually looks like over time. Here we've got our Department of Environmental Conservation that's responsible for establishing our statewide greenhouse gas emissions limits and is also starting a very ambitious air monitoring program. We have our Public Service Commission that needs to establish this renewable energy program. We've got our Climate Action Council that is developing the overarching plan that needs to be interconnected. In New York, we have a climate justice working group that is made up of environmental justice advocates who drafted now the criteria in New York for what is a disadvantaged community. We know we have the federal mapping tool that has come out. There's been criticism of it. In New York, we have one developed by activists, and there's reporting compliance along the way. We need to put these plans out. They need to be integrated. Every 2 to 4 years, we have to report on it. So the approach is, look, if we're going to be looking at air monitoring and all these other pieces, can we create a baseline? Can we require local and temporal emissions and co-pollutant data and develop the health indicators that are needed to create a baseline so we can try and even begin to see over time are we prioritizing the emissions and co-pollutant reductions in disadvantaged communities? Let's require as a metric to begin with direct spending and investment in jobs data, dug in terms of what's really happening at the ground level, which is something that a lot like for wind procurements, folks aren't used to doing, and then require that these things be reported on over time. Why do I think that this is important in New York, but why is it important on the federal level? Look, we've got this IRA, right? It's got big GHG reduction targets with huge implications for both success and failure, right? And by success, we've got some spending in good areas, and by failure, we've got big investments into things like carbon capture and sequestration that many of us just don't think are going to work. Energy justice is, and in this energy unjust world, right? There's this idea of, we're gonna reduce all the greenhouse gas emissions, and guess what? Y'all are gonna, Blacks, Indigenous, and people of color and low income, you're gonna get some good stuff too. That's not energy justice. We need to be baking into these energy rollouts actual analysis, actual data, and accountability through reporting over time. And right now, we continue to see limited analysis of these impacts on the so-called disadvantaged communities. If you're an advocate, everywhere you go, right? You ask, you say, Okay, you did some modeling. That's great. Have you thought about cumulative impacts? Have you thought about, how will this impact specifically disadvantaged communities, environmental justice communities, frontline communities? And the answer very often is no. Why? Because of exigency, lack of funding. Sometimes I think we have to come together and say it's lack of will, and we have to demand that if we're going to have this technocratic clean energy transition, and it's going to be just, that there must be accountability, and that scorecarding as an advocacy tool in the energy sector is something I think we should all be paying more attention to. And that is the end of my presentation. And I will relinquish my time back to Dr. King. Thank you.
So much. Before we head on out to Kristen, I wanted to remind the commenters, the people on the line, to please put your questions in the chat, in the comments, so that we can have them lined up when we open it up. Thank you so much, Raya. That was great. Kristen is next. Kristen, could you come on board and introduce yourself, please?
You bet. Can you hear me, and can you see my slides yet?
Not yet. I can't see.
Oh,
here
they are.
Yeah.
Great. So thank you so much. I'm delighted to be part of this illustrious panel. My name is Kristen Harbison. I am the political director for the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. I've been in this position for about 7 years now. Before that, I worked for the Maryland General Assembly as the staff member to one of our committee chairs. So I got to know the General Assembly of Maryland inside, and then I'm working with them from the outside. One of the things, if you're not familiar with Maryland League of Conservation Voters, and if you're not from Maryland, you certainly probably aren't, but you may have state leagues in your states that do similar work. We call ourselves the political voice for the environment. And we work at the intersection of climate change, for climate change and environmental justice towards a healthy environment for everyone in Maryland. One of our signature programs is our accountability program. And that's, I think, why I was asked to talk, talking about our environmental scorecard. We've been doing this for about, probably at least 30 years, maybe longer. Organizationally, we've been around for more than 40 years. And this scorecard has been an important part of our program. It's part of what we call our cycle of accountability. In our work, we'd work directly with the General Assembly to pass the strongest, most equitable legislation possible to address the dual crises of climate change and environmental injustice. We work and we ask the legislators to pass bills. As the political director, my job is as the principal lobbyist for the organization. So I go into Annapolis and I talk to all the members of the General Assembly and I say, please pass these bills. Following the session, and our session is like many states, it's a 90-day session from January to April. Following the end of the session, we do our legislative scorecard, like the picture. What's here is this is the cover of our 2022 environmental scorecard, and that holds the legislative accountable. We ask them to do it. How did they do? Did they vote the way we wanted them to vote? And then following that, in every 4 years, and this is one of those years, every single member of the General Assembly is up for election, as well as our governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, comptroller, everybody's up for re-election. And we use the information from this scorecard to help guide our political work. We are a 501c4, and so we can work in elections to help protect the champions in our legislature who have been strong advocates for our issues. Or alternately, replace them if we need to. We work on that. So that's actually happening right this minute. But in terms of our scorecard, it's a whole process. It starts really with what we call our hot list. We send it to every single member of the Maryland General Assembly. All 188 members of the General Assembly receive this every single week. And what this is a list of what the bills what we're tracking. The bills are tracking and what we want them to do with it. So this is something that gives them a guide for how they should vote on issues that we care about. And what we tell them is every single vote on every single bill that we submit on our hot list can be eligible for our scorecard. We don't score everything, but we can. So they are put on notice right from the very beginning. And this is an important part of our scorecard process because we figure we can't blame them for not voting right if we don't tell them how to vote. So this is how we do it. So every week, the hot list includes the legislation from Maryland LSAV's priorities, the broader environmental community priorities. So it's beyond just what we do. It's for our work. We try to represent the environmental community as a whole. And we do take requests from individuals, from other partner organizations, from legislators who say, please, can you put this on the hot list? Because they see this as an important tool to get things passed. So we don't put everything on the hot list that's requested, but we do try to make sure that what we're doing is reflective of the work of the community as a whole. One of the things we started doing a couple of years ago was saying, we need to, if you're going to put something on the hot list, if something's going to be on the hot list, it has to include a description of what the equity implications are. How is this a justice bill? Or is it? If it's not, say that too, because this is important. And that does weigh in on our decision on whether or not to put something on the hot list, because environmental justice is a core principle. And so if everything we do is not advancing to that cause, then we won't be working on it. So, and you can see in the picture that we have, one of the things we did was we asked them the position of this was support with identified amendments. And the amendment that we were asking for them to put in the budget was specifically to add definitions for overburdened. And that happened for the first time in Maryland law. We have definitions of what overburdened means, which is the first step towards passing those cumulative impact bills, like our friends in New Jersey is, that we are very eager to do something similar in Maryland. We take every single vote on every single bill that we put on our hot list, as well as other things that we communicate to the entire General Assembly. If I send an email to everybody in the General Assembly and say, this is a bill that we're tracking, this is how you should vote for it, that bill is now scoreable, and everything moving forward on that bill is then scoreable. We keep track of that. We put the entire list of every bill, every vote on every bill, we put in a spreadsheet. And then we look at the end of the year, after the session is over. We never know what we're going to score until after the session's over. But what we want to do is look at what happened. What were the big projects? What were the big bills that passed? What became important? Were there bills that were vetoed and overridden? Because that suddenly becomes more important. And we want to, again, show the story of the entire community's work. We want to make sure that we're balancing it. That's not just what we do, but what everybody is doing. What was the environmental community perspective? What were the interesting votes? Were there a lot of times in Maryland, as I think in many states, Democrats tend to vote with us, Republicans often don't, but there are places where Democrats split. Where are those votes? There are places where Republicans vote with us. Where are those votes? We want to show the interesting votes. We want to show that highlight. We want to highlight where the differences are between our legislators, so we can show who are the real champions and who are not. Also, if something doesn't pass, we may want to highlight that, because if it's coming up next year, the scorecard is not just about what's just happened. It also is something that we look to do what's going to come up next. This is again, it's a cycle. We're looking from every year, we're looking to what's in the next year. And then in the end, what we have is our scorecard that does a few things. One is we have an overview from the executive director to talk about sort of how we're seeing the whole session that just passed. And then the scores themselves. We do, and one of the things we started doing in 2020 was we started doing chamber scores. And this was a way for us to identify. So if they don't vote on a bill, how do we score that? What we say now is that we know it was introduced and we ask them to pass it. If they didn't score it, if they didn't vote on it, we can still score it because we can show that they didn't vote on it. So the House, the Senate, and the General Assembly as a whole, we say it passed or it didn't pass. And this has become a really important tool to hold the General Assembly accountable for bills that they don't vote on. Yeah. And then the crux of it is the individual scores. Every single member of the General Assembly gets scored. We show what they voted for and what they didn't. If they were excused from a vote, we don't hold it against them. But if they weren't excused, if they didn't vote, if they stood down from a vote and they weren't excused from that vote, that is counted against them. So, and then we try to identify sort of who the real champions are. Our green champions are the people who had 100% multiple years, and also sponsor legislations. We're trying to show who are the real champions, who are the real leaders in the story. And this is something that we've been doing it for almost 40 years, for more than 40 years. But we're trying to figure out, every year we do it, we look at it, we're like, how can we do it better? And I'm sorry, the slide looks a little bit weird. But we're always looking at different questions about how we can improve it, because it doesn't capture everything. Among other things, we've been very specific about saying, if everything we score has to be able to be tracked, there has to be documentation around the actions. So if they didn't vote on it, how do we score that? What our answer to that is chamber scores. But there are things like, I'm the lobbyist. I talk to all of the General Assembly members. I know they might be working against the bill, but they ultimately vote for it when they have to. So how do we capture that? How do we capture the nuances of the legislative session? And then there are things about the details. And this is really where environmental justice is often the crux of it, is in the detail of the legislation. If there's not environmental justice language included, and it should have been, how do we capture that? How do we score that? What do we do if an amendment if there's been an amendment sacrificed that is so that the bigger bill can pass? And this happens in really complicated bills. Something will get lost along the way. How do we account for that too? Do we say, yeah, that was a win or not? And then it's about balance. And what about bills that if we say we really want to do this thing, but we can't get anybody to sponsor it, so it hasn't even been introduced? We can only judge them on what they was presented them to do. So these are always big questions. We also are always looking at the agencies. There's more than just the General Assembly, although in my world, it sometimes seems like there's nothing but the General Assembly and 188 members. It is bigger than that. Government is way bigger than the 188 members of the House and Senate. How do we account for them? How do we judge? How do we hold them accountable for their actions? We do a governor's report card every 2 years. And that's a little bit different. But we do that. Do we need to do that more often? How do we hold them accountable? How do we hold the governor accountable? How do we hold the agencies accountable? So these are all the questions that we ask, and we're constantly looking for ways to improve our scorecard, because accountability is such an important part of making sure our government works. And so that's what I have today. I hope that it was helpful, and I'm always happy to answer any questions for anybody that may have any. So thank you very much, and I turn my time back over.
That was so impressive, Kristen. I had no idea what you did, and that was impressive. I mean, what an important role you have guiding your political work with the scorecard. I mean, that's impressive. Seriously.
It's a lot of work. It is. And this year, in 2021, we hit the General Assembly pretty hard. And everybody was really mad at us because we held them accountable. They didn't vote on one of the major climate change bills, and we said so, and they were mad about it. Both the House and Senate, almost everybody took a bad vote. So all of our Democratic friends, most of our Democratic friends, lost their perfect scores. Wow. They weren't mad at me; they were mad at themselves because they did the vote. But how do we do that? So we worked really hard this year, because it's an election year, to get that scorecard out before our primary in July. And so it was because people do use it to guide their votes, and that's what we want them to do.
Yeah, great. So we're going to go to our last presenter, but we're going to ask, I'm getting some questions in the chat, but we're going to hold them till the end. Vivek, it's you. Just go ahead and introduce yourself, and you can get started. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. King. And I really enjoyed, Kristen, your presentation, because it's a great segue and really inspired my presentation today, which I will add to the stream. Can everybody see it? Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vivek Ravichandran, and I am a rising second-year PhD student at the University of Maryland School of Public Health, and I am honored to present the first iteration of SIEGE's EJ Scorecard, where we aim to hold the Maryland General Assembly as well as state agencies accountable. So I want to start with an outline of this scorecard. It was really a double-pronged approach. So we began by tracking the voting histories of the MGA, the Maryland General Assembly. And we also looked at Maryland state agencies and their degree of public transparency, their prioritization of communities facing EJ issues, as well as their initiatives. And ultimately, this scorecard was utilized, can be utilized biannually to track progress over time, to identify our EJ risers, our EJ fallers, our EJ champions, and EJ antagonists. So I wanted to just briefly touch on the methodology for this project. So it all began with a key EJ search term, and these search terms are indicated actually on this slide right here. So I want to just keep this up for a few seconds. A lot of these are the themes of some of the presentations that will be seen during this symposium. But just going back to the methodology, we extracted bills that contain these EJ elements, and they were transferred to another spreadsheet. We then cross-referenced the bills to ensure that they were indeed pertaining to EJ. So this was done through conversations with the Mid-Atlantic Justice Coalition, or MAGIC, whom you will all be introduced to during the symposium as well as members of the EJ State Table for Maryland, to ensure that we had a quality control and that this was a more objective process. Once these bills were ascertained and cross-checked, we obtained their voting records from the MGA website, where we then ran a Python script to generate a raw score for each legislator. To put it quite simply, if a legislator had 10 EJ voting opportunities and they voted in favor of 7 bills, they'd receive a 7 out of 10. However, we took this a step further and we actually weighted certain bills. So we identified high priority EJ bills, and this was done in collaboration with, again, the Mid-Atlantic Justice Coalition members, as well as this EJ State Table, and none other than my supervisor and director of SIEGE, Dr. Shakobi Wilson. So those that voted in favor of high priority bills were then given double the points. So again, you have 10 voting opportunities. If a legislator votes in favor of 7 of those, and these are all high priority bills, then the legislator would receive a score of a 14 out of 10. We also provided a bonus point for legislators who introduced our co-sponsored EJ bills to really encapsulate their ability to take the initiative. And because you had the opportunities to score above 100%, we actually converted all of the scores into a percentile for standardization purposes. And this is really just a formula that breaks that down. So you have your medium priority bills. So you have general bills that is just the votes divided by the voting opportunities. Then you have that double point application for high priority bills, denoted as HPS, and then your aggregated score. So again, really a mechanism for us to weigh the process further and standardize the scoring. Oops. I just wanted to visualize that through this decision tree. So you have those, the key search terms, then you have the screening for inter-rater reliability and contextual relevance. So this was done through a conversation with MAGIC, other members of SIEGE, the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health, among other interested parties. And then if these bills were filtered out, they were not included in the analysis. And at the very end, we actually tiered the bills. So we had the high priority bills and medium priority bills. But I want to disclose that there were low priority bills, but these were ultimately discarded because we really wanted to front load the focus on high and medium priority bills. So without further ado, I'll get into some of my results. I want to just disclose that this is based on our methodology, and I'm not trying to classify legislators or even agencies based on anything like that. But what we observe here is that there is a clear partisan divide. So you have the Democrats scoring on average in the 64th percentile, but then you have Republicans scoring in the 16th percentile. And this is really similar to some of the findings that Kristen had mentioned, but it does beg the question, like, what are the reasons that these legislators are voting a certain way? Are there other factors that are influencing their voting patterns that cannot just be derived from, say, a formula? You do also have differences between chambers. So you have the Senate scoring higher in the state of Maryland compared to the House. And so on the left, we identify our EJ champions. So Delegate Sandy Rosenberg, Delegate Shanika Henson, and Delegate Mary Washington are some of our EJ champions. And then you have those that scored in the bottom percentile on the right. And then again, you can really see that partisan divide. Excuse me. So this really just summarizes the points that were already mentioned. So the last bullet point looks at future directions. So we can definitely apply this biannually to track progress over time and see who is really taking the initiative through the weighted mechanism to be our EJ champions. Sorry, viewers, I'm recovering from a sickness, so I apologize for that. But I did want to mention some limitations as well. So there was a reduction in the total voting opportunities from 19 EJ bills in the year 2019 to just 2 in 2020, which is attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic. So therefore, there was an increased opportunity for variability, which could have impacted our scoring mechanism. So that's the legislative scoring, and now I'll just briefly touch on the agency scoring as well. So we selected 9 agencies to be scored, and we derived our scoring criteria from the California Environmental Justice Alliance, or CEJA, and we utilized their principles of EJ. And similar to the legislative scorecard, we also had a quality control mechanism in place with multiple reviewers to ensure reliability of our system. So these were the agencies that were ultimately scored, and a lot of these officials will be represented at this symposium today. So I'll just leave this on for a few seconds. So the scoring criteria, again, is based on CEJA's methods, the California Environmental Justice Alliance. So we really looked at whether there was an opportunity for participation at every level of decision making. So was there an EJ office? Was there a liaison who had direct contact with the community? Did the agency commit itself to protecting not only the physical environment, but did they acknowledge and seek to repair damage that was done from past policies? The third bullet point focuses on, our criteria focuses on the health of workers, as well as those who have been historically impacted by environmental racism and in some cases environmental slavery. We also looked to see whether these agencies had educational resources so that they were taking the initiative towards building environmental literacy. And lastly, was the agency proactive? So it's not enough that an agency simply has resources available or is publicly transparent, but are they taking that extra step to ensure that they're addressing EJ issues? And so to guide our reviewers, so this process underwent several rounds of review. We had this ordinal scoring process. So relatively straightforward on a scale from 0 to 5, where 0 means there's actually no publicly available information, all the way to a 5, which looks at the agency centering its mission statement around EJ, using this EJ language, but also taking the initiative and having extensive and up-to-date information that is publicly accessible and evidence-based. All the agencies also received an opportunity to improve their score. And what I mean by this is it's possible that our reviewers might have missed certain points. So therefore, we gave them an opportunity to provide additional documentation. For example, the Department of Natural Resources has helped co-develop the Park Equity Mapper, as well as the Maryland Environmental Justice Screening Tool, or MDEJ screen. So these initiatives were then included and helped boost these agencies' scores. So all 4 of these agencies highlighted here were able to observe boosts in their scoring. Next slide. Okay, there we go. So these are our results throughout the study period. So as you can see, the Department of the Environment, as well as the Department of Natural Resources, consistently scored the highest across the period. The initial score indicates before providing additional documentation. So you can really see that rise in scoring. It should also be noted that 2020 was sort of the lowest point, which again speaks to some of the limitations in organizational capacity, as well as updates to the scoring page, to their agency websites. But all the agencies, even those that scored the lowest, observed a incremental rise throughout the study period. So basically, I already mentioned some of these points. I'll skip over this slide for the sake of time. And that concludes my presentation. So I apologize again for my voice and sickness, but power through this. And I do want to thank really quickly 2 students who helped fine-tune the scorecard this summer. One of them is present in this room, I believe, Sophia D'Alonzo, as well as Simone Stevens, as our first batch of CGIS summer scholars. So thank you to them, as well as my supervisor, Dr. Jacoby Wilson, for helping guide and supervise this project. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Dr. King.
So great. You're getting ready to make this part of everybody's work when they start writing on this stuff. This is just, you're setting the stage here. This is so great. Thank you so much. So I only have right now questions for everybody. So if we can get everyone back in the screen. Oh, great. Oh, that's wonderful. You guys have excited me. I didn't know how I was going to feel about this panel. You guys have really got some work going on here. So there was a question asked earlier in the panel comment page. And it's from Catelyn Mackenberg, and it's about are you or your respective groups planning on submitting comments to the WEJAC scorecard? That's the CEQ Advisory Council on EJ, and I think he's also saying it's called the Federal EJ scorecard. So anyone can take this up to respond, any of you.
Well, I'll say that I think it's extremely important. One of the big things that I do is mobilize as many folks as possible to comment on these important tools, and we've had a big mobilization to comment on the New York State criteria. We do our grassroots organizing to make that happen. Yes, commenting on the national tool, I really encourage folks to do it. And there are plenty of resources. I can maybe, if I can find some, I'll drop them in the chat. A lot of groups are providing talking points, sample testimony. They can help you send, these points in to the right folks, and even your state and local folks too. So I really encourage people to feel empowered to comment.
So I would say, Marva, obviously I'm actually on WEJAC. So, obviously personally, my comments will be like will be heard. But like Raya said, I think it's important to comment. As NJEJA, we probably won't comment. We're commenting on the Cumulative Impacts law. So that has to be our, as an Equitable and Just National Climate platform that we're part of, we commented on the screening tool. We put out formal comments on the screening tool and haven't had the chance to have that discussion about whether we will comment on the scorecard, but I think if we're able, we will. It's too bad it's happening in August. I'll say that, a tough time. But I agree with Raya. The comments are important if if groups have the capacity to do it, and that's one problem from the EJ perspective, right? A lot of groups just don't have the capacity to do something like this, which is a shame, and that's part of the capacity we have to build up, I think, in the EJ community.
For Maryland LSV, we are a standalone organization. It's general rule. We work exclusively in Maryland. We are part of the conservation voter movement, which consists of our national partners, as well as, again, there are 30 state leagues. And we tend to all try to work together to coordinate our responses to federal programs such as this with our national partners. So I don't know what we've done to date, but we will certainly be talking with our national partners and making sure that we are weighing in, because it is important for us to do so.
And
Yeah.
let me add this. One reason why it's so important is because right now, race is not in the screening tool. And in comments that we submitted from the platform and comments we just submitted from WeJack, we have urged the race be included in the tool. If it's not included in the tool, though, one way to get at race would be to include it in the scorecard, because there may be legal complications about including it in the screening tool, but most people agree those legal complications don't exist for the scorecard. So that would make the scorecard even more important, because we can have that accountability definitely based on race in the scorecard.
Good point. So Catlin has asked a part 2 question. If so, what key changes do you foresee in translating your work to a federal level of analysis? You're doing great in the state, so she wants to know how can you bring it up to the federal level? I don't know. What, you guys got any thoughts on that?
I can say that's something we think about all the time. And as you know, we all wear a lot of hats, but that's definitely in terms of serving on our state climate action council while also seeking to hold the state accountable. I've been asking, we've been talking about what does this federal package, mean for New York State and other states? How will state and federal officials coordinate to have seamless investments, seamless interagency investments and interventions, on the community level? This is a huge question, and it's something that I think we should all be digging into and holding folks accountable to.
Very, very good. We have go ahead.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts here. Cumulative impacts, we've gotten the word and have had conversations with EPA that they are interested in doing something with cumulative impacts.
They are or are not?
They are.
Okay.
And now, Marva, you probably know this better than anybody. Now, what they do will be critical. So we're waiting. A colleague of mine, Professor Ana Baptista, who's at the New School, her and I actually made presentations to Office of Research and Development about cumulative impacts at EPA. And I think, they're interested in doing something. And we're in our comments to them, we're just pushing them to say, whatever you do, please don't make it less strong than what we're trying to do in the States, which is a challenge, because what we're doing in the States right now is pretty strong. New York is getting ready to drop a cumulative impacts bill, I hope, that potentially stronger than the one we have in New Jersey.
We'll see if it gets signed. It's been passed, but the governor hasn't signed it.
So we're waiting and seeing. We have always argued to them that they have as we did New Jersey before our law, that they have the legal authority to do more than they're doing. In the area that Raya is talking about, we have also in New Jersey been advocating for a long time what we call mandatory misreductions, where we think plants located in EJ communities, power plants, no matter what type of climate change mitigation policy they're under, they should be forced to reduce their emissions. And plants that actually, the way we put it is that plants that whose emissions significantly impact EJ communities should be forced to reduce their emissions for the same reason that Raya said. We're really after reducing those co-pollutants, which are part of the disproportionate pollution load you saw in my slides. And that's one of the other strategies I talked about that we are pushing. There has been some federal movement on that. Not enough, but we've hammered at them so much about this that in the latest thing they're doing, with one of their trading programs they have, we're against trading.
Yes, of course.
They've actually started to add some standards to it.
Mhm.
It doesn't go as far as we have asked them to go with, mandatory emissions reductions in EJ communities. They started to add some emission limits, but they're not necessarily in EJ communities. But, hopefully more and more as they listen to people like Raya, right, talk, and what's happening in New York and what we're trying to do in New Jersey and advocating for nationally, we've seen a little bit of movement, and we're going to. In fact, I was just I've been, we're working on New Jersey, and we were asked to submit our comments on that in the New Jersey context to the national level, so we can maybe help push that along.
Well, I mean, what you're talking about is good news. I can remember when we were first talking about cumulative impacts at EPA, and I think that was in the mid-90s, and we didn't get anywhere. So I'm glad to see it's coming back around, and I appreciate the hard work. Because that was a long time ago. That was a hard fight back then. And I'm going to pray about the word forced. I'm going to pray about that word. Okay, back to the scorecard. I got another comment here from Marlene McWilliams. Is the scorecard set to measure what groups are doing in terms of litter in disadvantaged communities? So not yet. Something to put into your back burner of thinking.
I mean, we had our score. I mean, our scorecard has certainly, as I've said, there are limitations to what our scorecard can do. The way it's set up, the way we have the capacity to do it is just for what the state laws passed. We do, and in the past, we have had legislation that has been scored around litter. We've had some hard time. After we got our styrofoam ban passed in 2019, it's been stalled since then. We've tried to address other legislation, and it hasn't passed. We've mentioned it where we can in the scorecard. But in terms of individual communities, being able to hold individual communities accountable to their litter programs is not something that we have the capacity to do, but it would be really great if other organizations and individual and groups within the different communities could take these models of scorecards, whether it's ours or Siege's or whatever models they want to find, and put and create scorecards for their individual communities, because I think it is a valuable tool to drive action by our elected officials.
And if I can
Sure.
kind of piggyback off of that, I think one of the limitations of like scaling this to the national level is you have, with environmental justice screen and mapping tools, for example, in the state of Maryland, we had Delegate Ellis, or Senator Ellis, introduce a bill that would codify the MDEJ screen tool, but not all states have, EJ screening tools, which makes it a little bit more difficult to standardize all the states. So as Kristen was mentioning, certain states could implement indicators for litter and other, state-specific, factors, which could, bolster the score in that way.
Thank you.
So it's very, very specific. I think you also have climate in, like Maryland as a coastal state. We have a climate justice tool as well. Whereas, some other states who might be along oil pipelines, et cetera, might want to focus more on contamination and things like that. So, you have different variables, but I'm sure WeCheck has been doing a phenomenal job sort of navigating all of that already.
Yeah, but there are only so many people. I've been on those calls. I don't know if anybody else has. I can't imagine the volume of work. You can't imagine the volume of work they're handling. Hats off to you and your group, Nicky. Now, I was
Those
given some.
6.5 hour calls.
Yeah.
No, well, not that long. 4.5 hour calls,
Well,
Marv.
some were 6.
We're 6.
Yeah. So I was given a group group of questions to ask you. Most of these you've answered in your presentations, but the last one I do want to ask, because I'm just going to give it to you now. How does the Justice 40 initiative align with scoring criteria? Those of you who in the audience who may be unclear what Justice 40 is, it's the initiative that aims to deliver 40% of the overall benefits of federal investments in climate and clean energy, including sustainable transportation, to disadvantaged and overburdened communities. So do you see any alignment there, or do you suggest that there should be alignment? Just how do you, any way you want to answer that question, any of y'all? And that would be the last question.
I can start if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think definitely scaling it to the state level with the agencies, for example, for Maryland, based on their responsibilities, aligning the scoring accordingly. We didn't have Justice 40 as one of our search terms. So it's a great question because it's a way that we can fine tune our scorecard for future iterations as well. So yeah, that's how I would answer that.
I think that for us, Justice 40 is something that we want Justice 40 in everything. Every place where legislation is passed, where money is being spent, Justice 40 needs to be part of the conversation. And so our challenge is to, again, this goes into the details and the limitations of our scorecard, but it goes to the power of direct advocacy, where we had our legislation, many of the bills that we scored had a Justice 40 component to them. In one way or shape, in one place or another, in one way or another. The budget language that I mentioned briefly was directed towards budget language. We also have specifically in law for the first time, in law, there is Justice 40 related budget language. So this is, I think, it is absolutely part of the scoring process in terms of making sure that that everything that we do is directed to include Justice 40 wholesale. And if it doesn't include, if money is being spent and it doesn't include Justice 40, it doesn't have that vehicle, if it doesn't have that lens, it's not good law. And so that becomes just a fundamental principle of everything we do.
I'll jump in and I really want to give Dr. Sheats the last word on this for very good reason. But what I'll say is that the Justice 40 initiative was started by a Biden administrative executive order. Within the requirements of that order was the release by the government of a scorecard. And so just, but that is a piece of it. And what, it was mandated by the executive order, and we really need, and it's late, and we really need to hold the administration accountable on the scorecard. And then something else, as the J40 resonates across the country, in New York, as we are fighting every day, this is a floor, not a ceiling. 40% isn't enough. And it's wonderful to see it everywhere. We just really need to be strong. And the last thing, we've got to have investment in the community capacity. This has to be community directed. We need so much education, engagement, organizing, so that folks can have some self-determination in how this is spent. And it's a huge challenge. Can't recall, and in my generation, it's never happened before. There's not a lot of precedent for this going well. So I'll stop there.
And I'll pick up where I agree with everything you just said. And I'll just add that I think we've been, I mean, obviously has a lot of potential, but we've been really advocating that one of the priorities of Justice 40 should be addressing legacy pollution, the cumulative impacts, the things that Raya were talking about, co-pollutants, and I think one of our challenges is that I hope. What you asked about before, Marv, about taking this to the federal level. So we really have to develop the cumulative impacts policies at the federal level. We really have to develop the policies that Raya was talking about. And please call me Nicky, right? We have to develop those policies that she was talking about, that I've talked about, the mandatory misreductions from power plants, so that hopefully if Justice 40 is ongoing, there will be those types of programs there that can benefit from investments from Justice 40, and the benefits from those programs can be part of Justice 40.
Oh, okay. I don't see any more questions here in the chat. I do want to say that we're getting done about 5 minutes early, but you may need those 5 minutes because you do not want to miss the lunchtime speaker, Dr. Sharonda Buchanan. If you don't know her, she's going to have a lot to say, and you really will enjoy her. Does anybody want to add anything before we sign off? Well, I want to say that you guys were great. I really appreciated working with all of you. I know sometimes I come on a bit strong, but I have a good heart. Thank you for keeping to the schedule, for your presentations. Thank you for not caring about all the emails I sent you. I really do appreciate this panel, and I'm wishing this conference the best as we go forth until Saturday. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Right.
Thank you.